Okay, it being 11 o'clock, we'll call the meeting to order, and welcome to meeting number 31 of the House Common Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates. The committee is meeting today to begin its study of outsourcing of contracts. We have representatives from the Treasury Board Secretariat, Public Services and Procurement Canada, and Shared Services Canada here today. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format, pursuant to the House Order of June 23, 2022. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. Regarding the speaking list, the committee clerk and I will do our best that we can maintain a consolidated order of speaking for all members, whether you're participating virtually or in person. I'd like to take this opportunity to remind all participants to this meeting that screenshots or taking photos of your screen is not permitted. I'd like to welcome the witnesses for their opening statements. We will start with the Treasury Board and then hear from PSPC and then finally SSC. You will have each have 5 minutes to make an opening statement. And so we will start with Mr. Franco. You can begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As you said, my name is Emilio Franco. I'm the Executive Director responsible for procurement policy within the Office of the Controller General at the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat. I'm pleased to be here today with my colleagues from Public Services and Procurement Canada, as well as Shared Services Canada. Monsieur le Président, je vais tout d'abord expliquer.
Mr. Chair, I'll begin by explaining how the Treasury Board Secretariat supports the management of investments and procurements. The Treasury Board Secretariat's Office for the Controller General is responsible for providing functional direction and assurance on financial management, the management of our services and acquired assets, and internal audits across government. Specifically, with respect to services and acquired assets, the Office of the Controller General provides policy and guidelines to investment planning, projects, and procurement. Government procurement ensures that the Government of Canada has the necessary tools and expertise to successfully deliver programs and services, while ensuring best value for the Crown through fair, open and transparent processes.
Complement the work of Canada's professional public service and enables the government to acquire special expertise and to meet fluctuations in workload. Shortages in certain groups and in specific geographic locations also make the use of professional services necessary to maintain operations. For example, service contracts are put in place for nurses to deliver temporary health care in Northern Canada where support is critically needed. Service contracts are also put in place for firefighters brought in to help quell forest fires in British Columbia. The government also requires services to operate and maintain our assets and facilities, things like cleaning our buildings and repairing our vehicles. While Treasury Board sets the policy direction for government procurement, deputy heads of federal organizations are responsible for ensuring that the resources are in place to deliver on their respective organizations' mandates. What this means is that the decision to use procurement to meet operational requirements rests with the departments and falls under the responsibility of the respective deputy head. Ultimately, departments must exercise due diligence and effective stewardship of public funds when awarding contracts, which are required to be issued in a fair, open, and transparent way in accordance with the Treasury Board's policies, as well as laws, regulations, guidelines, and frameworks concerning procurement. In closing, let me reiterate that procurement is an essential part of how the Government of Canada delivers programs and services to Canadians, and that the government has the processes, systems, and controls in place to ensure that procurement is conducted in a manner that upholds the values of fairness, openness, and transparency while meeting public expectations and ensuring best value. Thank you again for the invitation today, and I'll be happy to answer your questions concerning the Government of Canada's procurement policies. I'll pass it to my colleague.
Thank you, Mr. Franco. And we'll now go to PSPC. And I'm not certain who the speaker is for PSPC, but it looks like Ms. Royds is her mic off, so you have the floor, ma'am.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to Public Services and Procurement Canada's outsourcing procedures in my role as Associate Assistant Deputy Minister of Procurement. I'm joined today by my colleagues, Kim Steele, PSPC's Assistant Deputy Minister, Digital Services and Chief Information Officer, and Ron Cormier, Director General, Business Technology Solutions Sector. As you're aware, Public Services and Procurement Canada, or PSPC, procures goods and services on behalf of departments and agencies throughout government. These procurements range from office supplies to military equipment and everything in between. The department buys on behalf of other federal organizations some $24 billion worth of goods, services, and construction each year from nearly 10,000 suppliers. SPAC travaille en collaboration avec le ministère.
PSPC works in conjunction with Shared Services Canada to procure IT services for departments and agencies that offer digital services to Canadians. And we do this in the context of the laws, regulations, policies and directives that govern procurement, including those set by our colleagues in the Treasury Board Secretariat. As with all of our contracting actions, PSPC seeks to enhance access, competition and fairness in a way that aims for the best value to the Crown and the Canadian people. Mr. Chair, the Department's procurement processes are implemented with the goal of accountability and integrity, and there are checks and balances in place to ensure government contracting withstands the highest scrutiny. Additionally, every effort is made to ensure that our processes are open and fair to bidders. That scrutiny extends to contracting out for services, including professional services and information technology services. The decision to make or buy, which is often referred to as outsourcing, is made by our clients and can be done for several reasons. They include accessing specialised skills or knowledge that may not exist in departments, including skills shortages in IT areas of expertise, which are in high demand across the government and the private sector. These services may also be contracted out if there is a need to transfer knowledge that is not available within the public service, or to provide surge short-term capacity that cannot be met with the human resources in place in departments.
Services are contracted out. The client departments are responsible for making all reasonable efforts to use existing or new employees of the public service. They are therefore responsible for making the make or buy decisions. Once they have made that decision, we manage the procurement process. In doing so, PSPC has mechanisms in place to ensure that cost estimates and contract values reflect actual expenditures. For example, for task-based contracts, such as the contracting of human resources, expenditures are tracked against submitted timesheets, which the clients review to ensure the hours worked are accurate and reflect the work completed. For solution-based requirements, such as conducting studies and producing advisory reports, contracts are often based on firm prices, and competition establishes pricing and provides the assurance of value for money. Mr. Chair, I should note that medium to small enterprises make up the vast majority of Canadian suppliers that receive government contracts, approximately 88%. Along with the department's work to ensure small and medium enterprises are engaged in federal procurement, PSPC's procurement specialists are leveraging the government's buying power to support social and economic goals. This includes helping to generate jobs and growth and increase participation of underrepresented groups. For example, to help the government meet the target of awarding 5% of federal contracts to Indigenous businesses, procurement specialists may choose to restrict their supplier search to only those suppliers who have identified as Indigenous. This is in line with the procurement strategy for Indigenous businesses. PSPC is also developing a supplier diversity program, which is a core component of the Supplier Diversity Action Plan announced by the government in January of this year. I know that these topics will be explored by this committee at upcoming meetings. To conclude, Mr. Chair, I would like to emphasize that PSPC remains committed to ensuring that our procurement processes are open, fair, and transparent. This extends to contracts for human resources and IT services. In the end, this will ensure the best outcomes and best value for Canadians. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we will now go to Shared Services Canada.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and members of the committee for your invitation to appear today. I'm happy to be able to address you and answer your questions along with my colleague.
Minister, Networks and Security Services at Shared Services Canada, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Samantha Hazen, Assistant Deputy Minister and Chief Financial Officer. The current digital landscape is a highly complex system of network infrastructure, and Shared Services Canada is modernizing our IT infrastructure. To realize the vision of a digital government, we must deliver end-to-end digital services to public servants and Canadians. A high-performing and resilient enterprise network is a key underpinning enabler of a digital government. Technologies are rapidly changing. It is essential that the Canadian government keep pace. And as of the COVID-19 pandemic has shown, it's even more critical in a crisis. SSC has taken an enterprise approach to modernization. And this means SSC continues to consolidate, standardize, and modernize networks across government. We are ensuring our strategy is aligned with current best practices and adaptable to future requirements for our network and security services. To get where we want to go, SSC has been investing in the development of standards, IT infrastructure and contracts, consolidation, technology simplification, standardization, as well as a modernized procurement strategy. SSC has established a robust project management process that involves assessing all potential options to deliver new services or address new needs. After looking at best practices, capacity, and existing solution, SSC determines the process that best allows it to deliver products and services which are cutting edge, aligned to global best practices, and offering extensive support and functionality to users. As we continue to effectively modernize how we deliver digital services to Canadians, we are increasing our workforce and investing in attracting and retaining talent from across Canada. We are committed to continuing to train our existing workforce to adapt to a rapidly changing IT landscape and emerging needs. Our employees are our greatest assets. The complexity of our IT infrastructure and the speed which we are modernizing does not always allow us to use in-house expertise. When working with external service providers, our employees provide the guidance necessary to ensure success in all of our initiatives. Over the past 2.5 years, we've adopted digital solutions to unprecedented challenges at lightning speed. In these times of rapid changes to technology and security, speed and scale matter. Execution and implementation matter. In order to effectively deliver on our initiative, we comprehensively assess our business objectives and determine the best way to meet them. There are situations where we must rely on commercially available resources in order to focus on the strategic side of a project. Examples would be mobile devices service, which offers 3 types of cellular plans, a broad selection of mobile devices, or our Government of Canada wide area network, which is a fully managed network service that interconnects our partners or clients' location across metropolitan, regional, national, or international boundaries. When we are required to outsource, SSC conducts transparent, open, and fair processes as per the Government of Canada's policy on planning and management of investments and the directive on management of procurement. Our employees are critical in ensuring these processes are successful. Whenever possible, SSC uses competition to get the best value for Canadians. Industry has been and will continue to be a critical stakeholder as we work to transform the federal government's information technology infrastructure systems. SSC's procurement strategy involves leveraging private sector expertise through early engagement, flexible process, and the ability to mitigate the risks. Our Agile Procurement Process 3.0 is a highly collaborative approach to procurement that will also help the Government of Canada with its socio-economic and climate-related policy objectives. Our strategy includes reducing the barriers to entry for small and medium-sized enterprises, companies run by women, Indigenous, Black, persons of color, and other underrepresented groups. In 2021-22, 66% of the SSC-funded contracts were awarded to small and medium enterprises, valued as approximately $746 million. Of these, 90% of the total number, which is also 90% of the value of those contracts, were awarded to Canadian small and medium-sized enterprises. There's an impressive array of Canadian small and medium enterprises, and we are encouraged to cast a wider net in procurement opportunities to tap in on that knowledge and innovation. SSC is committed to getting more Canadian companies involved in competing for government contracts. Shared Services Canada is working hard to create economies of scale, more secure and reliable services, faster turnarounds, enhanced collaboration, and reduced risk, and an agile procurement process that is fair and transparent, ultimately better serving Canadians. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nadeau. And we will now go into our questions, and we will start with Mr. Macaulay for 6 minutes.
Mr. Chair, thanks. Witnesses, thanks very much. I have to start with disappointed that none of you are here in person for this very important study. Perhaps in the future we'll see the folks actually come into committee. Treasury Board, I'd like to start with you. What was the spending in the last fiscal year on consulting companies such as Deloitte, et cetera? It had been reported, I think, the year before it was $16.7 billion. What was it last fiscal year, please?
Thank you for the question. Unfortunately, I don't have the numbers in front of me, Mr. Chair, but the information is available in the public counts, and we're happy to get back in writing with the specific numbers if the committee wishes.
Yeah, the public counts, of course, I know the letters of representation have been signed off on, but they haven't been published yet, so parliamentarians, unfortunately, do not have access to them yet, so maybe you could let us know. I want to get to I'm going to just stick with the general outsourcing to consulting companies. Now, over the last 5, 6, 7 years, the size of the public service has grown quite rapidly. I think without benefits, salaries are about $50 billion. If we use 2 years ago, the dollar spent on consulting companies rounded up to $17 billion, that's almost a 34% add to our cost for providing what perhaps many people think the public service should be offering. Does the Treasury Board have a sense of concern about this almost a ghost department making up such a large amount, and the criticisms that a lot of these reports should be done by our ever-expanding public service? And what does it say about all these, the size of our public service, if we have to source out so many contracts to the Deloittes of the world?
Thank you for your question. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, there's a number of reasons why service contracts need to be put in place. I mentioned the examples of nurses for temporary health care in Northern Canada, firefighters for British Columbia.
Sorry, sir. Sorry, I'm going to interrupt. I'm talking solely about contracts to the Deloittes, McKinseys, et cetera. The nurses hopefully do not come through Deloitte, so I just want to stick to those ones.
Thank you for the question. As I mentioned, the decision to procure, it rests with the departments. And so I would turn to the departments if you have questions regarding specific contracts that may have been put in place.
Does Treasury Board have any role apart from setting a general framework? Does Treasury Board, as the guardian of the public purse, ever follow up on any of these contracts that are sent out?
Thank you for the question. As you highlight, Treasury Board does set the administrative policy framework for procurement, which is guided by principles of fairness, openness, and transparency and integrity. And although TBS does set this policy framework, in practice, the accountability does rest with the deputy heads.
Does Treasury Board, as the keeper and guardian of the public purse, ever do any follow-up on the billions of dollars being spent? I want to give you an example. We had a controversy we actually studied in this committee about between PSPC and Global Affairs sending a contract to a Chinese state-owned tech company to do security work for our embassies. The government then hired Deloitte and paid them $250,000 to do basically a 4-page report with a recommendation: don't contract out sensitive security tech to despotic regimes. Like, who's overseeing this? It's Treasury Board responsibility overall, but who's overseeing this massive increase in outsourcing to ensure that Canadians are getting value for the money, but also that they're actually following the Treasury Board guidelines, if Treasury Board itself is not doing it?
Thank you for the question. The administration of government contracts is subject to internal audits by the given departments and as well as the Auditor General. And the findings of those
Are those
reports
audits outsourced to Deloitte as well, or are they actually done by public service?
I cannot speak to the specifics of an individual audit, but the Government of Canada does make use of public servants for internal audit, and it does make use of contractors to conduct audits.
Would you make public those audits to this committee, please? If any are done through Treasury Board, or I'm sorry, I missed that part. Was it solely done through the AG?
So there are audits conducted by the internal audit of each departmental organization, many of which are published on their respective departmental websites. And of course, the Auditor General's reports are public for all. If there's a specific audit report that this committee is interested in reviewing, I'm happy to take that away and have the department get back with a response.
Thanks. I want to switch over to Public Works, please. I want to give you an example. I've got a order paper here, and this is only one of 4 we put in. This one's about 500 pages, listing all of the contracts given out to various consulting firms. This one is Deloitte. I'm looking at 3 dates, a week apart, each one worth $72,000 for scene security and event security services. Basically, Deloitte was hired 3 separate times to see if the contract was awarded fairly in a transparent manner. It's $250,000 repeating the same item 3 times in a row. Does public service, do you find that justified? PSPC?
Thanks very much for the question, Mr. Chair. And as was alluded to in our opening remarks, there are a variety of reasons that we do outsource specific tasks, whether it's for specialized skills or given a surge capacity or other elements that are lacking in our in-house expertise. I'm afraid I don't have the specific line item that is being referred to here, so I would have to look at that particular information. But as I say, when we do outsource to a consultant company for specific work, it is generally in line with that rationale. And again, as a common service provider, we do this on behalf of other government departments and our clients who are the holders of the technical requirements.
Thank you. We'll go to Ms. Thompson for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. My initial questions are really open to all witnesses, so please feel free to provide the perspective from your own department. First point is around special expertise, and what sort of special expertise does outsourcing let the government access what they don't have in-house? So what is it that really defines that special expertise and that in relation to what exists within government departments? And it's open to all witnesses.
Perhaps I'll start, Mr. Chair. So thank you for the question. I would say that there's a broad range of expertise that the Government of Canada needs to deliver on its programs and services. And it's not to say that expertise may not reside in government, but in many cases that expertise is either needs to be complemented, supported, or is only available for particular activities, and that needs to be augmented or supplemented. And then perhaps I would turn to my colleagues in PSPC or SSC to speak to specific areas of expertise that they are seeking as part of their own program activities.
Perhaps I can speak for PSPC. So as the Chief Information Officer, I support a portfolio of over 300 applications, many of which are mission critical. Some reside on legacy technology. So finding expertise to continue to support these applications can be challenging, particularly nowadays with the the mobility that's taking place in the workforce. So if I need, for example, very specific, a coder who has expertise in COBOL programming language, which is old, that's an area where we often will have to go out and look for that expertise in the private sector. So that's one example.
And maybe I can add, thank you, Mr. President, from a shared services. As my colleague, I guess, from Treasury Board was saying, it's a combination of both. It's the expertise, the specialized expertise, but also just incremental capacity that we need. The nature of our business right now, it means that the demand exceeds capacity. In addition to our own workforce, we do need to increase our capacity to deliver on all of the projects, especially when we adopt new technology as part of our network modernization initiatives right now that we've actually posted on our website. Adoption of the cloud, fairly new for the government. This is where we would probably need also extra capacity and expertise. We're deploying a software-defined networking. We're adopting a zero trust architecture. Those are actually new technologies, new way of doing things for us, and specialized expertise to complement our own capacity is required.
Thank you. And if each department could respond to how outsourcing helps meet unexpected fluctuations and the unexpected life events, COVID in particular. If you could all respond to that, please. Do you want to start with Public Works and Government Services?
Sure. And again, just so I'm responsible for the digital portfolio within PSPC. So often, as Patrice mentioned, we are looking at innovation, new technologies, and so sometimes those become projects. So kicking off or launching a new application, we often require expertise for a limited period of time. So we will bring in consultants to help work with our staff to get the initiative launched. And we really work with those consultants to ensure that knowledge transfer and expertise remains in-house. So then when the project is over, it falls back on the public servants, the staff within my organization to maintain that application going forward.
Thank you. Perhaps Treasury Board would like to respond.
Thank you. And so as an area responsible for procurement policy, we actually do not do procurement ourselves in my organization. So perhaps I'll move to Patrice to provide you a more fulsome response.
Thank you, Mr. President. Actually, very similar to my colleague in PSPC. Obviously, we're running a large portfolio of project here at Shared Services Canada. So the ability to grow fast, very often, it's important, and this is done obviously leveraging professional services in a number of cases. Very often we have a start date, end date, clear deliverables. Those are actually perfect opportunities to augment our capacity, leveraging private sector resources. You've mentioned COVID. That's also a good example. When we need to respond back to a crisis and to a surge, I guess, of demand, it's for us, it's absolutely critical that we have in place contracts that we can actually tap in to those resources fast and for a short period of time, and then it allows us to help, I guess, our existing staff with this increased demand.
Thank you. And actually, I'll zone in on Public Works and Government Services for this question. Many recent budgets have included funding for system stabilization. Was that a case a decade ago? And if not, why not?
Thank you for the question. So I wasn't here a decade ago in this particular role, but I would say that ongoing investments in maintaining technology is something that needs to occur on a regular basis. With the rapid evolution of technological change, we need to continue to invest in keeping our applications and systems up to date, current, in order to ensure that we address security threats, as an example. And so, unfortunately, sometimes it can be challenging to maintain those systems and keep them up to date. And when that happens, we fall behind, and so additional investments may be required. But best practice is To maintain our applications, continue ongoing investments in ensuring that the systems are maintained, stable, current, and up to date.
Thank you, Ms. Steele. We'll now go to Ms. Vignola for 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson, and thanks to the witnesses for being here. Thanks for going to the trouble of making your remarks in part in French. It's most appreciated and sincerely so. I believe that I'll start with Ms. Royds. I think you would be best positioned to respond to my questions. Ms. Royds, in recent years, folks have referred to the fact oftentimes that women have been used as contract workers in the public service throughout their entire careers. And yet, when the occasion arose for them to become permanent and to benefit from the same benefits at retirement as permanent staffers, they were laid off permanently a couple of weeks later and then rehired to do exactly the same line of work. The upshot of that is that even though they spent their lives in the public service doing the same job as public servants, it turns out that they didn't have the same benefits at the end of the day. How did that practice ever come to be, and why is it still occurring?
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Chair. And if I could, I think that I can speak to this from the perspective of the role of the common service provider as PSPC, where we do support other government departments in their work when they do require outsourcing in order to achieve certain types of work. For instance, if they are looking for particular specialized skills, as well as in relation to potential search support.
I'm sorry to cut you off. I apologize. I'm talking about women, mainly women, who have spent their entire lifetimes in the public service without having the title of public servant. They were contract workers, and when it came time for those women to get a permanent position, they were laid off. And at the end of their careers, they ended up with no benefits that public servants enjoyed, despite the fact that they did the same work for their entire lives. Does this practice still exist nowadays?
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Chair. And I think that in the particular instance, it would be important for me to outline that we do have policies in place to mitigate against the instances of what would be called an employer-employee relationship. We do have particular policies in place to ensure that when we do put contracts in place and bring in outsourced resources, we're doing so whether it's for a specific task or deliverable or a specific solution. And that, again, is to mitigate against the exact instance of what could be considered to be an employee-employer relationship whereby an employee, someone would take on a role as like a public servant as an employee of Canada. And so we do have the policies and procedures in place to ensure.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, this policy that you're referring to, when was it put in place? And can you assure me that there are no longer any contract employees, and I'm referring primarily to women, there are no longer any contract workers currently who do the exact same job as the full-time public servant sitting next to them, without the benefits, without the pension, and with the constant risk that when they may become permanent, they're laid off for a couple of weeks and then rehired to do exactly the same line of work. Can you guarantee me that this kind of practice no longer takes place?
Thank you very much again for the question, Mr. Chair. And as I indicated, we do have the policy and procedures in place to mitigate against the risks of such an employee-employer relationship. If I could, I would actually ask, I have my colleague from Treasury Board Secretariat who would be the owner of the policy for the Government of Canada. As indicated, we're a common service provider where we support the work of particular government departments in putting in place their procurements. But to speak to the broader policy, I would ask that my colleague might be better placed to provide the background that was being sought.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The position of the Government of Canada regarding ensuring that measures are taken to avoid employer-employee relationships has been a matter of policy for quite some time, both in our previous procurement policy, which was the contracting policy, and now reinforced in our new directive on the management of procurement, which came into effect May of this year, which specifically requires that both contracting officials and departmental officials responsible for engaging in contracts are aware of the risks of creating employer-employee relationships, and that they're taking measures prior to and during the performance of a contract to avoid those risks occurring, and including terms and conditions in contracts to make sure that it's very clear to the recipients of those contracts the nature of the arrangement in place, and that those conditions protect the government in the case of a employer-employee relationship being created.
Thank you. We'll now go to Mr. Johns for 6 minutes.
Natural Resources is currently outsourcing 2 full-time, quote, senior ATIP consultant resources, and they've invited suppliers to bid on the 1-year contract with 3 one-year options to extend. The estimated value of the contract is $3.75 million. Based on that estimate, the contract would work out to about $469,000 per year for an ATIP consultant. I'll hazard a guess that this is well above what an ATIP officer would be paid as a public service employee, and I'm imagining a significant amount of the contract will go to the firm awarded the contract and not the person actually doing the work. What are the policies around contract renewal, for example, and do companies have an automatic right to exercise an option to renew? And is a contract potentially up to 4 years, addressing a short-term staffing shortage? Maybe this someone from PSPC or the Treasury Board can answer.
Perhaps I'll start. And so, government contracts, when a government contract goes out to tender, it is required to outline the full scope of the requirement, including, as you mentioned, option years. It is not a requirement to exercise those option years, but they are available as a matter to mitigate risk for the government in the event that there is a need to no longer continue the services or to address other matters that may arise in the contract. Without getting into the specifics, as I've not seen the contract or the requirement you've mentioned, there may be a number of provisions in the contract that expand the scope or require additional resources, which may increase the overall value of the contract. So without getting into the specifics of the contract or seeing the details, I wouldn't be able to particularly answer that question, but perhaps I'll turn it to Molly
Can anyone speak
on.
Yeah, great. Maybe someone could speak specifically to this contract, because it seems outrageous, this amount of money. And I guess the other question is, I know between 2010 and 2015, the government of the day made significant cuts to the public service. Now, has that caused an increase in outsourcing? And if so, ultimately, has that caused an increase in costs associated for procurement? Maybe Molly can speak to that, Ms. Rollins.
Thanks very much for the question, Mr. Chair. And I'm afraid I'm not able to speak to the specifics of that particular contract, and it is possible that it might be within the authorities of a particular department. As the common service provider, we're responsible for the procurements that exceed an individual department's own authorities, and that's when PSPC would be responsible for the procurement. And without knowing the details of that particular one, it is possible that would be within the authorities of that specific department.
Ms. Royds, can you speak to the comment I made at the latter comment about that there was significant cuts to the public service between 2010 and 2015? And has that caused an increase in outsourcing and therefore actually an increase in overall costs for the work that's needed to be done?
Thanks very much again for the question. And I believe that in terms of speaking to any particular trend, I'm not in a position to speak to a particular trend. As the common service provider, again, we are responsible for managing the procurement processes associated with the requirements of our particular departments. And we do support, particularly in the IT space, as both my colleagues from PSPC as well as Shared Services Canada have indicated. We support a number of technology projects and transformation projects that are being undertaken at the moment by the government, which do require us to seek the services and specialized skill sets of a range of contractors to support the work that is being undertaken. But I am not able to speak to any particular trend.
Thank you. In 2019, HUMA committee adopted a unanimous report on precarious work that was the result of a study required by a PMB put forward by the Liberal member for Sault Ste. Marie. That required, amongst other things, for the federal government to stop using temporary help agency workers and to work with ESDC and other government departments to properly staff government services using permanent employees. The federal government is shamefully the country's largest user of precariously employed workers who are subject to the whims of temp agencies. This report was never addressed by the government as an election immediately followed. What steps are you taking to ensure that this recommendation is met in an expedient manner? I'm sure someone can answer this. Okay.
I can go ahead. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. So at Shared Services Canada, as my colleague, Mr. Nadeau, mentioned, our employees are our greatest assets. And as such, the department has been investing in growing our workforce over the past 5 years. So we are indeed working towards reducing a reliance on temporary help and increasing support through our employees. We've increased our employees over the past 5 years from just under 6,000 to now just under 8,000 federal workers at Shared Services Canada.
10 seconds. Thank you. I'll add it on next time. We'll now go to Mr. Lobb for 5 minutes.
First question for, I believe it's Ms. Royds. And you had mentioned in your opening comments about the percentage, the 5% goal for Indigenous. And my question to you is, in the last calendar year, what percentage did you achieve?
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Chair. And I'm afraid I actually do not have that number immediately at hand, but I'd be very happy to provide that. In terms of the 5% target that has been established by the government, this was put in place as a policy of government in April. And so each individual department is responsible for reporting their progress against that particular target. And PSPC as a department, of course, is in the first phase of departments that will be reporting that. So I know that we will be doing reporting at the end of the year for that particular number, and I would have to see if there is anything that we have from a previous year that we could make available to the committee for the department.
Okay, good. I wondered, is there anybody on the panel that can tell us, of all the contracts that are letted in a year or over the last number of years, what percentage of those contracts actually come in at the quoted price? Is there any, or are they all adjusted after the quotes come in? Anybody? Can anybody tell me that?
Perhaps I'll just at least start, and then my colleagues, if they wish, might want to add on. But I'm not aware that we do track in that manner, Mr. Chair. but we do have a process where our technical authorities, which would be our client departments, are responsible for the business cases and the cost estimating that is undertaken, which is consistent with the Treasury Board directives and policies. And then as PSPC, we manage the procurement processes, which we mostly will do, obviously, on a competitive basis. And
Sorry
then,
to
of
interrupt,
course,
but wouldn't that seem as one of the key performance metrics in your whole department is the percentage? Because it is, a lot of these contracts are very complex, they're very detailed, they're very precise, they're many pages long, we've seen them all. And then nobody at the end of it, you're telling me nobody at the end tracks if a project was quoted for $5 million, nobody tracks if it came in at $5 million? Is that what you're telling me?
So again, thanks, Mr. Chair, for the question. I am not aware that we would track it, certainly as PSPC, as the common service provider. This would be something that an individual department, in terms of their responsibility, in terms of owning the requirements and the estimates. I'm just not able to speak to that more broadly. I don't know if either of my colleagues here, if Emilio might be able to speak to it from a TBS policy perspective, because as I indicated, the cost estimations are in line with the directive.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Molly. So I would just add to say that the Government of Canada does approximately 400,000 contracts and amendments each year. I would say, anecdotally, the majority of them are simple and straightforward requirements, where I would expect that the quoted price matched the final contract value. Now, there are a number of complex procurements that are conducted by the Government of Canada every year, and the nature of these procurements are complex in their nature. Often the deliverables or the final outcome is uncertain, and there is an evolution in collaboration with the contractor to achieve a result. Now, it is difficult then to assess whether or not an increase in contract value is the result of the activities that are engaged with the contractor to ultimately solve a problem, or if it is an increase from the originally estimated quote. And that, as Molly mentioned, is not information that the Government of Canada, I think, tracks at a granular level. But we can say that the information is typically publicly disclosed through our proactive disclosure, where all contracts and amendments over $10,000 are made publicly available on the Open Government portal.
Okay. Again, 6 seconds seems like plenty of time to get right into the meat of all these issues and topics, but maybe next year.
Thank you, Mr. Lobb. We will now go to Mr. Johari for 5 minutes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the generosity. Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses. My question is going to go to Ms. Royds. Ms. Royds, in your opening remarks, you talked about that the department buys on behalf of other federal organizations some $24 billion worth of goods, services, and construction for each year from nearly 10,000 suppliers. And you also indicated that about 88% of those are from small and medium-sized businesses. Also, I understood from your opening remarks that you work with SSC to procure IT services. And within the IT services, you talked about access to specialized knowledge, knowledge transfer, and dealing with some surge of the services. IT consultants are easily the largest type of the professional services that the government contract, externally. Can you explain why and what type of services are actually being outsourced?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. And as I indicated, at PSPC, as a common service provider, we are responsible for managing the procurement processes on behalf of our client departments, and they are responsible for establishing the requirements of the individual procurement, and they tend to do so for a variety of reasons. In particular, when there are specialized skill sets that are being sought to support a particular project or initiative, surge capacity that is required, if we need independent external advice, or if we are lacking the expertise within our department, or within an individual department, because again, we are doing this on behalf of other government departments across the Government of Canada, and so our role as a common service provider is then to manage those particular procurements. Thank you very much.
You were quite clear in your opening remark. Also, the decision to make or buy, which is often referred to as outsourcing, is made by our client. And I assume your client in this case is shared services, correct?
Actually, the client could be any of our government department clients.
So can you tell me which client?
Including shared services.
Yeah. Can you tell me which client right now is spending the largest share on IT services, outsourced IT services?
I'm afraid that for that particular question, I'm afraid I do not have that information immediately at hand for IT services, because of course there are a range of different services that we do procure at PSPC. So I would have to come back to the committee in writing if I could with that particular piece of information.
Can you please do that? I would be very interested to know how those IT services is broken down by department and by the services. I understand you're not making the decision, but you're making the procurement, and I'm sure you have measures in place. With about a minute and a half, probably I should ask, you mentioned that transfer of knowledge is one of the areas of IT services. I'm not sure whether I should ask you or I should ask the SSC, Mr. Nadeau, but I'll ask the question and hopefully one of you to answer. The Professional Institute of Public Service of Canada has suggested that for IT contracts, there is no mechanism to transfer knowledge and expertise back to the department and agencies for a project after a project is finished. And you said that IT services, one of the elements are transfer of knowledge. Is this actually the case and is always the case?
Maybe I can start on that one. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, you're right. In terms of professional services, where typically we have resources on a per diem basis, even if contractually there's no transfer of knowledge part of this contract, the reality is they actually work as a team. Very often, the nature of our business makes it that those professional services, those consultants, are actually part of a team, and they work together with government employees. So the time they're here, this transfer of knowledge is actually taking place. We have witnessed that, and so this is probably where this transfer of
my apology. Am I clear to understand that there is no actual contract for knowledge transfer, but the knowledge transfer is taking place as the project is rolling out by working side by side with our clients? Am I right to understand that?
It would actually be both. I was specifically talking about professional services, like on a per diem, where it's a managed service or a contract we put in place for a project. Very often, there's actually provision in there for a transfer at the end, especially if the what was outsourced was the creation, the build part, and then it's taken over by government employees. There will be part where a transfer will take place at the end. But specifically for professional services, I would say most of this transfer takes place day to day as we work together, part of the same team.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nadeau. We'll now go to Ms. Vignola for 2.5 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Well, listen, I don't know who I should ask my question of at this point, but I imagine it would be for Public Works and Government Services, since it's about contracts. Earlier you said you contracted out, that there is outsourcing of specialised services that we don't have in-house. And yet, to my knowledge, on the Saint-Jean military base, there have been contracts for basic concierge services, sweeping, cleaning bathrooms. Why is it impossible for the department to get its own employees for those kinds of contracts that are neither specialised nor temporary. Washing floors, cleaning washrooms, basic concierge and maintenance services are everyday services. In such cases, why was there outsourcing and no use of in-house services? This is not a specialisation. This is not a temporary service. Second question, how can we make sure that businesses that are hired, whether it be in the area of defence or in any other department, how do they get the same benefits for their employees as the government offers their own public servants? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Chair. And the specific contract and capacity that is being contracted for, I'm afraid that I would not be able to speak to an individual department's requirement. But as I did indicate, each department is responsible for determining that reasonable efforts have been undertaken to ensure that what they are contracting out for cannot be undertaken by the public service. And as we have indicated, there are several reasons why we would seek to outsource, including because we are not able to find if it's whether it's a specialized skill set or something that is in high demand or something that is not available or for particular surge support. But again, I can't speak, I'm afraid, to the particular requirement that is being
Thank you, Ms. Royds. We'll now go to Mr. Johns for 2.5 minutes.
Understaffing has frequently resulted in contracting out of government services, either to temp agencies or entire programs are sent to the private sector. Some areas that are currently understaffed are ATIP officers, which I talked about earlier, HVAC operators, cleaners, border officers, passport agents, and the list goes on. What is being done to ensure that the government departments are properly staffed? Ms. Royds? Anyone?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. As I highlighted in my opening remarks, the decision to outsource is a departmental decision, and one of the things that departments are required to do under policy is to consider what is the best way in which they deliver on their investments and deliver their results for Canadians, looking at market conditions and seeing what the best approach is to deliver on those outcomes. In terms of a broader Government of Canada strategy, I'm happy to take that question away. It is broader than a procurement policy question, so happy to take that question away for colleagues within the department.
Okay, well, thank you. Mr. Franco, global research shows that governments pay more when public sector work is contracted out for poor services. In fact, the UN Special Rapporteur on Poverty and Human Rights in 2018 discussed privatization as a cause of poverty, which still is costing, while still costing governments more. What analysis have you done on the total cost of contracted out work, including the cost of procurement, compared to bringing this work in-house?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I'm not familiar with a specific study looking into that question. As I mentioned, the departments are making that decision.
The study, what analysis has been done in terms of the total cost of contracted work, including the cost of procurement, compared to bringing this work in-house?
Thank you for the question. I'm not familiar with a particular study into that question.
So you haven't done any analysis to see whether it's, cheaper to have in-house staff versus, contracting out?
Thank you for the question. I would go back to, again, the decisions that are made by the deputy head on an individual program or investment basis to make look at the particular service or program they are looking to deliver, look at the resources that they have available to them within their own professional public service, and what requirements they may have that need to be contracted out. And then they would make a decision on the basis of that information for that particular program or service delivery.
Thank you, Mr. Franco. We'll now go to Mr. Macaulay for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Mr. Franco, I just want to come back to you, and I realize that you might have limited oversight on this, but is there a sense within Treasury Board, again going back to supposed gatekeepers of or protectors of the taxpayers' purse, that perhaps the outsourcing is out of control? I think 2014 it was about $6 billion a year, growing to $16.7 billion. Is there any sense of worry or concern that we're growing like this, again, this hidden wing of the public service that clearly is not, or clearly there's very little accountability for our oversight for? And I bring up before you answer, I bring up the example of, again, $250,000 going to a consulting company to say, don't buy sensitive security tech from a despotic regime. The example I brought up earlier to PSPC, there's 4 examples where, and I actually looked up the item on the web, there was 4 $71,000 contracts given for PSPC on behalf of RCMP for fairness monitoring on a RFP, and basically for over $280,000, we got 4 identical reports with a 1-paragraph answer. So, there's no oversight for this value for taxpayers' money, and who is going to step up to protect taxpayers? Who will step up? Treasury Board clearly is not, even though I believe they should be responsible. How do we get a handle on this?
So thank you for the question. As I mentioned, when departments are looking at how they're achieving results, their decisions are made in accordance with that. And as departments are responsible under our policy to publish their results through the departmental results reports, parliamentarians and the public receive transparent, clear, and information regarding to the departments, their decisions that they've made with regarding to resources and the results they're achieving with those expenditures.
Yeah, right. No offense, Mr. Franco, that's not kind of an answer. Again, who's looking after the taxpayers here? Who's looking after ensuring accountability? Treasury Board's not. It's very clear the departments are not. There's 11 of us around this committee. We don't have time to go through. Again, this is just, you can't see it, but I've got several hundred pages just in Deloitte contracts. Is there no sense of concern on Treasury Board that maybe the rules aren't being followed? Maybe the framework is not set up strong enough, or departments are just, granting contracts willy-nilly without any concern for taxpayers' money. I mean, $16 billion is a lot when we spend $50 billion on salaries. Again, that's an added 1/3. Who's watching this? Because the departments aren't, obviously.
Thank you for perspective, Mr. Chair. So departments are responsible for applying Treasury Board's mandatory policies. There are instruments within their organization for monitoring and auditing their application and taking corrective action in the case of non-compliance. So in a number of cases, they're reporting to Treasury Board.
Does Treasury Board have any role apart from here's a policy and then Treasury Board just walks away?
There are a number of
That's oversimplified question, I realize, but it doesn't look like anyone in the government is responsible for this $16 billion in spending.
So departments, for contracts that are within departmental authorities, they of course manage those, and Treasury Board has no oversight over those contracts. However, a limited number of contracts every year go towards the board, in which due diligence is provided over those contracts through submissions. Of course, it's important that the Treasury Board does not approve the contract itself, but rather provide the department responsible to enter into the contract as an approval authority. And so there are a select number of contracts every year that the Treasury Board does see.
No, I think you've answered my question, and it's not you personally, Mr. Franco, but it does not appear that there's any real oversight for this 16, 17, who knows what it is last year, if it was 16.7 2 years ago, maybe it's trajectory, it's up to 18 billion. There's not a lot of oversight, and as a parliamentarian, I have to say I'm incredibly concerned that Treasury Board's role as well. We just write the rules and then the departments look after it. Then you go to the departments and they kind of give a shrug as well. But again, that's not you specifically. I think it's our system.
Thank you, Mr. McCauley. We'll now go to Mr. Housefather for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I'm going to come back to a subject that Ms. Vignola brought up in her first line of questioning, because I think we need to clarify a little bit. So Ms. Vignola was talking about the idea of people, usually women, that were working the same jobs as others who were civil servants, and then were being terminated and rehired and spent their entire careers without getting benefits. And both of the answers then revolved around how we prevent employer-employee relationships. And it didn't sound like we were getting to the point which Ms. Vignola was making of protecting the little person. The employee-employer relationship protects the government from not being the employer, but it doesn't protect the little person who is allegedly being, forced to do a job and then labor laws are not being complied with properly. I don't think there is such an issue in the federal government. So I want to give the opportunity to everybody to come back and clarify. So first, Ms. Royds, when it comes to, let's say we were hiring, not outsourcing, but hiring someone to be a civil servant. The federal government would not simply terminate someone before the 12 months of their continuous protection would apply under the Canada Labor Code, because that person would normally be under collective agreements, would be fairly treated, and we would not simply be summarily dismissing people and bringing them back willy-nilly, or we would have multiple union issues in every department, correct?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. And while I'm not a representative of our Human Resources branch, I can speak to the fact that we do, in our hiring practices, abide by our human resources policies that are, of course, established by the Chief Human Resources Officer. And we do have those policies in place that govern the way that we do hire employees, and as well as their employee benefits.
And then to Treasury Board, to Mr. Franco, obviously what a contractor is, what an outsourcer is defined by law. It's defined in the Public Service Employment Act. It's defined by CRA rulings. It's defined in the Canada Labor Code. There's all kinds of tests that you would need to meet to be a contractor. You can't simply be doing exactly the same job as a civil servant day in and day out and then be considered to be a contractor. So can you talk to us a little bit about the tests that exist where we ensure that there is not an employer-employee relationship being developed between the government and the employee of the contractor before we determine that somebody is indeed a contractor?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. The test for whether or not an employer, an employee, or a contractor is an employer or an employee, there is a legal test. There are 4 parts to that test, I believe, in Canada. Speaks to elements such as the use of tools, risk of opportunity, risk of loss, and a few other considerations. And I'm not a lawyer, so I don't want to expand too heavily, but there is a framework under which we can determine whether or not there is a risk of employer-employee relationship. And as part of the training that procurement professionals receive is to help them identify areas in which what those criteria are to make sure that they're mitigating them in their contracts. And as I mentioned in our policy, we do have a requirement that the business owners or the individuals across government that are engaged in hiring outside resources are aware of these risks and are taking steps to manage them.
And again, not only risks, but also let's come back to the little person, the person that's hired by the contractor. We also have policies related to ethical treatment by contractors of their employees. We don't just enter into contracts with people and say, you don't have to respect the Canada Labor Code and you don't have to respect provincial employment law. So could you talk to us about how does the government screen contractors? to ensure that work done for the government reflects the ethical expectations of Canadians and not, and follows the law with respect to the people they employ or that they hire. I don't know if that would be you, Mr. Franco, or Ms. Royds.
I'll start with the answer, but as you did highlight, there are two elements that Public Service and Procurement Canada are responsible for, namely the Code of Conduct for Procurement and the integrity regime, which I think goes to the greater details of your question. So as you highlighted, there's from a procurement policy perspective, the Government of Canada's procurement policy highlights that procurement should be seeking to obtain socioeconomic and best value outcomes. And best value does not necessarily mean lowest price. It also considers the broader social and economic value that a contract may be obtaining. And there's a number of programs that the Government of Canada has to help ensure that contracts are, in many cases, meeting similar requirements that may be the case for public servants. For example, the Employment Social Development Canada's labor program has the Federal Contractors Program, which has a requirement that suppliers to the Government of Canada with a resident workforce of more than 100 people or $1 million must put in place employment equity obligations. And so this is a program that we have. As well, in a number of cases, while it may not be prescribed by law, contracting officers are putting in place requirements in their contract for contractors to abide by, which may cover a number of the legal obligations that we may have within Canada. For example, official languages and the requirement to provide services to the public in both official languages. So these are things that we would put in place through contract, all of which are permitted through our policy framework and actually encouraged to be considering these kinds of things in how we conduct our procurements. And I'll pass it to Molly to speak to PSPC's area of responsibility.
Thank you, Mr. Franco. And we'll now go to Mr. Lobb for 5 minutes.
Okay, thanks very much. I'll give you one example, and maybe you folks here can help me understand it. And I'm not picking on this company. It's just because it's a big number. It's according to the numbers I have in 2021, 2022 fiscal year, Brookfield Global Integrated Services did over $1 billion in business with the federal government, and over 200 million of that was in professional services. And so that's a substantial number, I would say. That's a nice piece of business that Brookfield has with the federal government. But on the professional services side of things, if I wanted to find out what those contracts for and what those how much those contracts were bid and how much they came in at, how would I find that? Is that readily available, or do I have to? What way could the public find out where there's value there? Anybody answer that for me?
So I'll speak on a broad basis. So I believe the contract with Brookfield is a PSPC managed contract. So Molly may be able to have specifics on it. But all procurements majority of procurements are conducted in a fair, open, transparent way, which means that the initial requirement is posted for public competition on the buy and sell platform, now the Canada Buys platform. So they're made publicly available, which is the first indication of what kind of services may be being sought under a contract, as the contract would be required to detail what services are expected to be provided. And then, as I previously mentioned, once a contract is awarded, that information is, if the contract is above $10,000, is made publicly available on our proactive disclosure website, through proactive disclosure on the Open Government website, and any subsequent amendments that would be issued against that contract.
So, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Thanks for the question. Just because there was reference made to a specific contract requirement that PSPC does manage. That the particular one in question is one that we manage on behalf of a client department, which is National Defence, which relates to the relocation services associated with specific requirements for the Canadian Armed Forces. So that, if I don't have the information directly in front of me, Mr. Chair, but I believe that is the particular professional services.
And sorry, you said that's relocation services? Is that what?
Potentially. I'm afraid I do not, without the information in front of me that you have,
enough.
But that is one of the larger requirements that we do manage with that particular supplier. So again,
probably not 211 million a year though, right? For relocation services, I hope.
So I can't speak to the specifics, but I can say that we do turn to these consultants to provide us with critical mission critical services that are provided to the government and to our specific client departments. But certainly, if there's a more specific question, I could offer to come back with information.
Okay. And you're saying these contracts, they're all publicly available for Joe Smith down the street to look at and even a member of parliament to look at, or not?
Thank you for the question. So the initial, what we call the resulting contracts, when a procurement is made available, publicly available for competition, the solicitation that's issued includes a copy of the contract. So that would be an ability for the public to actually see what the potential contract would likely to look like. Once the contract is awarded, as I mentioned, information regarding the contract is made publicly available on proactive disclosure, but the specific contract and its amendments themselves are not. Typically, that information is considered commercially confidential information under the Access to Information Act, but it is can be called upon, and there may be a provision of some information if requested through the ATIP process, should the public be interested in a particular contract.
Okay. I guess just one last question before my time runs out. Is, obviously, the last number of years have been record government expenditures, and I'm not trying to make this political. Just, is there a point in which the senior public service members, such as yourself, go to ministers, go to the government, and say, at this point, it's maybe time that we really take a look at what we're doing here, and maybe take a break and find out if we're getting value for dollars here? Because it seems to me, like what Kelly McCauley was saying, is a lot of this stuff seems to be getting out of control. And you add up Deloitte and KPMG and all these companies, it's way over $100 million a year for them as well. I looked up Iron Mountain, it's like $14 million a year every year. So is there a point which we need to go back and say, enough is enough, and we maybe need to take a look if we're getting value for all these contracts and find out which ones are not mission critical, as you might want to say?
Thank you for the question. I would say 2 points. One is that, of course, the Department of Finance is responsible for funding decisions. But I think broadly, previously highlighted at this committee, there was a mention that TBS is engaging in a strategic review. Now, I can't go into, I don't have the details regarding that review or the areas of inquiry, but looking at how the government's expenses is something that Treasury Board is currently looking into.
Thank you, Mr. Franco. We'll now go to Mr. Kazmierczuk for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure exactly who can answer this question for me, but we have about 500 public sector nurses in Canada that travel to remote and isolated Indigenous communities to provide vital healthcare services. I know that we also hire externally to deliver some of those temporary healthcare measures in Canada, and specifically in northern communities and isolated communities. What advantage does this provide in terms of being able to deliver those critical services in hard-to-reach communities?
Thank you for the question. So without getting to the specifics of the program delivery for Indigenous Services Canada and healthcare in the North, what I would say is that in many cases, this, as I mentioned in remarks, supplementing our professional public service is an important way to respond to urgent and both shortages, but also urgent situations. So I could assume in the case of healthcare, if someone is, if there's a need in a particular area for an additional medical support that is likely urgent or time critical, engaging services from the outside, from contracting for those services would be an essential way of meeting that need and ensuring those services are provided.
Thank you. And recently, I think just a couple of weeks ago, the federal government announced that it is tripling both recruitment and retention allowances for, again, Indigenous Services Canada nurses who are serving the 50 remote and isolated communities in Canada. And I just wanted to ask, what does that knowing that we're tripling the recruitment and retention bonuses, what does that say about the state of the labor shortage that we're facing in healthcare in terms of our public sector nurses, specifically as it relates to being able to provide those critical vital services in northern Canada?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. As I highlighted, I'm by no means an expert in healthcare, but I would say that market conditions are an element that go into the consideration of whether or not the public service can meet a need, or whether or not a department would need to resource through contracts to deliver on that expertise or on those services. And so when you see areas of market shortages, limited market availability, that will obviously impact the public service. And that would lead likely to that decision looking at what the best way to meet that immediate need would be. And that may very well be procurement.
Do you foresee the need for, those externally hired temporary healthcare workers? Do you see the need increasing in the short term?
Thank you for the question. Unfortunately, that's not a question that I'm in a position to answer. But I would say that the Department of Indigenous Services Canada would probably be best placed to speak to their requirements for nursing and healthcare professionals.
Okay, thank you. I know that some folks around the table have talked about the lack of environmental, social, and governance, the ESK bona fides of external suppliers, unlike governments. How does PSPC include ESK criteria in its procurement?
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Chair. And I believe that my colleague outlined earlier in this session a little bit about the procurement policies that we have in place and how we seek to ensure that the government's broader socioeconomic objectives are included in our procurements, and in particular related to ensuring, we talked a little bit already about the government's target associated with the 5% of Indigenous, but we also have requirements associated with greening and with other government priorities. I think if I could, I would actually turn to my colleague, Ron Cormier, who could speak a little bit about how we include these particular items within our individual procurements associated with our policies and approaches. So if I could turn quickly to Ron, please, just to give a quick example. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Molly. What I would offer in terms of examples is there's a number of different types of contracts that we enter into on behalf of our clients. One of the ones that I would draw attention to is there's a series of supply arrangements that in order to make the procurement process more efficient across government, PSPC as a common service provider makes those available, and departments use them to be able to contract a little more efficiently and quickly by using some elements that we've done the groundwork for. As part of those, we work with our supplier community to identify, for example, within that community, which suppliers are either Indigenous owned or led. So within those instruments, for example, if I'm a client department and I'm interested in using one of those tools to be able to contract, I'm presented with options that will allow me to select Indigenous suppliers within that inventory. And moreover, when those suppliers exist and have made themselves known to the Government of Canada, the selection methodologies are structured in such a way that you'll always be presented with an Indigenous choice. On some of our lower dollar instruments, we're also trialing some additional socioeconomic policies that can bring a similar degree of flexibility to help other equity deserving groups. And we're looking at whether that's something we can do in the future more broadly. Within individual contracts, large ones that are publicly tendered where there's a request for proposal. We're also now working very actively with all the client departments that come to us for service to help them to strategize on how they can achieve their Indigenous 5% component as part of contracting. We have to take into consideration Canada's obligations globally using the trade agreements as a guidepost to ensure that Canada meets those obligations. And within that framework, we're able to, for example, lend weight in the bid evaluation process to companies that can offer significant subcontracting or even set aside primary contracting opportunities to suppliers, for example, that are Indigenous owned or led. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cormier. And if there's anything further that you would like to add to that, please by all means submit that to the clerk. We'll now go to Ms. Vignola for 2.5 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. On Friday, I tabled a notice of motion regarding the Governor-General's Secretary expenditures, seeking more detailed documentation, and I don't want to cut off my colleagues in their line of questioning to our witnesses, so I seek unanimous consent to take 10 minutes after the third round of questioning to read the motion aloud, discuss it, and vote on it.
You can read it now, or you're asking unanimous consent to have it read at the end of the meeting, is correct?
Oui, pour pas couper le...
Yes, that's correct, so that we don't eat into the questioning of the witnesses.
Do I see unanimous consent around the table? She's asking for unanimous consent to have a quick meeting afterwards on her motion, as opposed to interrupting the witnesses. Thumbs up.
No, sir, not Claire. Going past one.
At the end of this meeting.
After one. Okay.
Yeah. Good.
Thank you. And
Je laisse...
Thank you.
Yeah.
For 2.5 minutes.
Oh, sorry, my round. Okay. Thank you. We've got great interpreters, obviously. It's been a really difficult time through COVID. We've seen a lot of them have workplace health injuries, and we value them so much. Maybe I'm going to ask a question around that. What are the costs of outsourcing translation to freelancers, given that they may not reflect the added expenses related to payroll, invoicing, fallout with clients, etc., and which add to the overall costs? And maybe you can talk about what are the anticipated costs of outsourcing interpretation services to freelance interpreters.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, for the question. And PSPC, of course, does have the Translation Bureau as part of the departmental portfolio, but I'm afraid that we're not able to speak to those specific details today. So we'd be happy to submit that information in writing to the committee.
Frequently, rigid government budget practices are the reason for contracting out. And even though the services are not up to necessary standards, they'll do this. And an example can be found in a study done at the Royal Military College in the mid-2000s. A quote, the anecdotal assessments gleaned with respect to this particular approach were that inferior results were noted. During this lengthy period, the cleaning standard fell far below what was required for RMCC, especially in the critical residential spaces. It was observed that in an effort to increase the profit margin, the contract cleaners were using inferior or improper cleaning products, which resulted in additional maintenance, environmental problems, and health and safety issues, resulting in unfit living conditions for cadets, end quote. At D&D in particular, services are often contracted out because the salary wage envelope provided to base commanders is insufficient to meet salary needs, while they are provided with extremely generous private services budget lines, incentivizing basically privatization. What steps are being taken to ensure that the quality of the service to the public and to other government departments is the first order of business?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I'll speak first from a policy perspective, and then my colleague, Molly, may wish to speak from a practice perspective. So from a policy perspective, it's important that procurements that are put in place are actively being managed from from a performance perspective. And so, we're very clear in our policy that there's a responsibility to be documenting, monitoring, and investigating issues of contractor performance as they arise over the course of the contract, and to be leveraging the appropriate measures that either by law or under that particular contract to address the documented issues. And maybe there's a perspective, Molly, you may wish to add from practice.
I would just simply add to what Emilio has said, that we are responsible with working with our client departments. We would be the contracting authority, and our client departments, of course, as the technical authority. So we would work together to ensure the performance monitoring and the appropriate contractual activities as allowed by the policies that, as Emilio has indicated. And as I say, we work hand in hand with our client departments for any specific requirement as contracting authority and common service provider.
Thank you, Ms. Royds. We'll now go to Mr. McCauley for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And I just a quick question to the three departments here, and just a real quick yes or no. If you believe taxpayers are getting fair value for the money, the billions being spent on outside contracts, just a quick yes or no. Bueller. Why don't we start with PSPC? And if I'm putting you on the spot, just say, you're putting me on the spot. It's an unfair question. That's fine. If you feel strongly about it, feel free to answer. If it's an awkward question, you feel I'm putting you on the spot, that's very fair. That's not my intent. I just want to get. Then the follow-up question I was going to get is the three of you, especially TBS, is how should we move forward to ensure that there's proper oversight and transparency on the spending to ensure that taxpayers are getting fair value, considering as well the exponential growth of the public service at the same time. So PSPC, can we start with you? Ms. Royds?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. And again, I think as we have indicated, this is an area that would be in each individual department's accountabilities and responsibilities under the appropriate legislation, as well as the various oversight bodies. I know that we've previously spoken to the role played by the Treasury Board, as well as the Auditor General, and our own individual responsibilities as public servants for ensuring value for money for Canadians. And certainly as PSPC, we take that responsibility very seriously as we ensure that we run fair, open, transparent, competitive processes as a common service provider, and ensure that value for money. We have, spoken to the reasons for which we do.
Sorry, let me interrupt you there. When we talk about fairness, like I look at PSPC, and there seems to be a lot of the commentary today. Well, we have a fair, transparent bidding process. I'm arguing that a lot of these contracts shouldn't even get to a bidding process. So there's a real disconnect between myself, I think what my colleagues in the opposition are saying is a lot of these contracts perhaps shouldn't be getting even to that bid. But it almost seems the feedback we're getting is, well, it's okay because we're fairly giving Deloitte $250,000 to tell us not to buy sensitive security equipment from despotic regimes. How do we move forward so we're not putting forward such, I'm going to be blunt, wasteful outside contracts? I don't care if they're fairly awarded to Deloitte to tell me not to buy from the dictatorship of the Communist Party. How do we get to let's not send out so much contracts? Does that need to start with the Treasury Board? Is it education at every single department?
So, Mr. Chair, I think that, again, thank you for the question. And in these instances, it would be the individual departments who are responsible for establishing the requirements that PSPC does conduct the procurement processes for. and certainly they are responsible for ensuring that they do have a business requirement, and they make a business decision around critical services for delivery of programs to Canadians. And again, we have established. I think that I don't want to be sorry. I don't want to repeat.
Sure. Why don't we pop back? Why don't we pop over to
outsourcing.
Mr. Frank with the Treasury Board? Same question. Like, how do we stop the train before it becomes a runaway train? Like, how do we stop bad contracts or wasteful spending going forward? Again, is it just leave it solely to the departments? Because that's not happening.
So thank you for the question. So, an element of our procurement policy is that procurements must be delivering a best value for taxpayers. That's an important element of what we have. I think we've iterated quite heavily here that the decision for the majority of procurements rests with the deputy head of that particular organization.
That's probably not working. So how do we go forward? How do we fix that? I don't believe that's working. And I've got, frankly, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of examples from the order paper question. One of them came back 656 pages of contracts of about 15 contracts per page. And this is solely for consulting contracts, not for nurses, cleaning. This is solely for consulting companies. Like, how do we ensure that? And I don't believe leaving it to departments is working. Do you?
So thank you for the question. If you have specifics, if you've brought forward particular examples and specifics of contracts that you'd like to investigate, you may be interested in inviting the particular departments responsible for those contracts and those decisions to speak to the decisions that they may have made.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We'll now go to Mr. Baines for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our guests that are here today. My first question is to all of the departments. Is there a specific set of criteria that must be met before you consider outsourcing, or does each consideration merit its own criteria?
So thank you for the question. I would say from a broad perspective, I'm not familiar with a policy that sets out a particular criteria or set of requirements, but perhaps our colleagues in Shared Services Canada or PSPC may want to speak to the particular decision-making that they do in their individual make or buy decisions.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe I can start from a shared services point of view. It is on a case-by-case basis for us. So we've actually, the decision leading to outsourcing or not, I guess we follow a pretty robust, process internally. All options are always being looked at, focusing obviously on best practices, our own capacity, if there's existing solution in place, if we can build and operate in-house or not. Our preferred delivery method has always been to taking advantage of the internal resources first. So the right decision process combined with the right balance between government employees and consultants, especially in the IT field. So far, I think that has actually led to a best value in delivering our IT services to our clients.
Okay, and are there any guidelines or incentives for buying services from Canadian enterprises? How do you foster Canadian industry through contracting?
Thank you for the question. What I would say is that, as mentioned, the procurement policy encourages, in fact, broader considerations for socioeconomic and environmental considerations within procurement. And so what this means is that departments are actively encouraged under Treasury Board's policies to look at how they can incorporate manners and approaches that will allow contracts to be for participation for Canadian, particularly small and medium enterprises to participate in the procurement process. For example, requirements to unbundle so that smaller companies can participate in individual requirements rather than bringing something together and only large multinational companies being able to participate. And so this is something that we've actively taken a policy position on to support. And I know a number of initiatives and programs are in place, particularly within Public Service and Procurement Canada regarding social procurement that they may wish to speak to.
Okay, thank you. And this question for shared services. Canadians rely on the digital services provided by their governments. Can you please share with us why we need to work with our global partners in order to protect Canadians and their personal data?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. Actually, for the vast majority of our contracts are with Canadian companies, and including small, medium-sized enterprises. But taking advantage of the private sector is actually key for us. A number of our key services allows us, I guess, we have no choice but to leverage capacity and the nimbleness of the private sector and rapidly adopt, I guess, innovation solution, typically at lower cost for Canadians. So we have a combination of both. But the vast majority Canadian based. If you look at when we outsource turnkey solution, that includes the hosting of data, for example. It is a must. It has to stay within Canadian soil. So this is specified in many of our contracts. So. But in other cases, we have no choice. We also have partners right around the world. We are actually managing 200 locations connected to our network, which is outside Canada, all of the missions, embassies around the world. So we do have contracts in place, obviously, with service providers outside the country.
And how is that sometimes necessary? Like, what are the why do we have to do that?
Well, it is the only, obviously, solution available most of the time, especially when it comes to networking, for example. If we're in a specific country, well, it's not a Canadian type company that will be able to deliver the infrastructure required outside this country. But we typically have a lead organization, a Canadian-based organization. Best example is probably the contract we have in place for the international network being provided by a number of companies around the world. But the main contract is actually with Bell Canada. So Bell would act as the integrator on our behalf, ensure that service level agreements are met, that our security controls are being met with all of those organizations around the world.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Baines. Okay. And we'll now go to Mr. Lobb.
Thanks very much. The first question is to public service and procurement. And it's just in regards to just a general question maybe. And it's in regards to the National Capital Commission and some of the work that they're doing in the parliamentary precinct here on the redevelopment. And my question is, and I don't think I've really ever got a good answer on it, is in a world where it seems like people are not going to be going to the office as much as they have in the past, and this big redevelopment project that was announced in the last number of months to add I think it's close to 200 office spaces here just on Wellington and Sparks. Does anybody ever look at that and say, we already have probably 500 too many office spaces downtown. Maybe we need to redevelop it. We don't need to add another 150 office spaces. Does your information and your data show that we're short office spaces or that we have a surplus of office spaces downtown here?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I'm afraid that as the Associate Assistant Deputy Minister for Procurement, I'm not responsible for the office portfolio, and my colleague, the Chief Information Officer, is not as well. So we're not in a position to answer that question. It would have to be other colleagues of ours from within the portfolio.
Would that be something that we could have followed up on, you think? Would that be something that you folks will be able to get back to the committee on?
I can certainly take the question back and come back with a response to the committee, yes.
Okay. Thank you. I just want to go back to the question on some of the professional services with Deloitte and KPMG and Ernst & Young and PricewaterhouseCoopers, and there's a pretty long list of professional services they provide, and many of them I would suggest are not mission critical, and they amount to tens of millions of dollars. Is there an initiative out there to review all these professional services contracts that are let to these companies and to really find out if they are quote unquote mission critical or just nice to haves? Like I see one in a list, and it was to do a workshop, and there's just like it seems like an endless list of expensive things, and maybe they're only 10 or 20,000, but they somehow manage to add up to tens of millions of dollars. Okay. That's fine. It's fine if nobody wants to answer. I don't blame you. The other one is well, here's another one. I'll just throw this one out. Is it a conflict of interest to have the accounting firms come in to advise CRA? And I'm asking for procurement or treasury board or anything else. Is it a conflict of interest to have them come in and consult with CRA on how to conduct their business? And then on the other side of the table, they're the ones that are constructing contrived ways to not pay your taxes for corporations and wealthy clients. Is that a conflict of interest? Is that something that you folks have raised in your time in the public service?
Thank you for the question. So without, unfortunately, not able to provide an opinion to the particular question, but I will say that our policies related to procurement also reiterate values that are highlighted in the Values and Ethics Code for the public sector. And so there's requirements, and there is a directive on conflict of interest that's also in place to help protect the integrity of our procurement processes.
I'm good. I think it went over last time, Mr. Chair, so I'll give my time back.
Thank you. We'll go to Mrs. Thompson for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And actually, my questions this go are with Treasury Board, and I wanted to circle back on a question my colleague asked on the outsourcing of nurses, particularly in northern communities. And my question is around the chief nursing officer. Is this person now involved in outsourcing of nursing services in northern communities?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Unfortunately, I cannot speak for the Chief Nursing Officer, and so if there is a question regarding their practices, you may wish to invite them to speak to the committee.
I'm wondering, would they be consulted in terms of, the very real need in Canada around nursing and primary health care services? Would you see a consulting role for the Chief Nursing Officer?
Thank you for the question. I would say that departments that are making decisions regarding nursing services would likely look to a variety of areas of information to support their decision, which may include the Chief Nursing Officer, but I can't speak to the specific role or their involvement in those decisions.
Thank you. I appreciate the clarification. And so staying with the Treasury Board, President of Treasury Board's mandate letter instructed her to explore, within the context of the public service skills strategy, potential pathways to improve recruiting from outside the public service for short-term or permanent roles. Could you speak to the federal government, how the federal government is able to improve its outsourcing practices?
Thank you for the question. And so I've highlighted throughout the testimony that our new directive puts a stronger focus on ensuring procurements are managed in a way that delivers real results for Canadians and is consistent with our socioeconomic and environmental objectives. And so one of the things that our new policy frame put in place May of this year allows is that broader balance of not just cost, but also socioeconomic outcomes. And so in terms of improving our outsourcing practices, what we have as an opportunity moving forward, particularly supported by the activities by Public Service and Procurement Canada through their social procurement programs, is to look at how we can incorporate some of these broader considerations into when we are outsourcing, both in terms of achieving benefits for Canadians, but also things like achieving our 5% commitment with Indigenous businesses through either directly or through subcontracting. So there's a number of opportunities to improve how we outsource, particularly in terms of how those outsourced procurements can incorporate broader value for Canadians through the various objectives that we have at hand.
Thank you. And could you speak to situations where outsourcing of services ensures better value for taxpayers, and if indeed this exists at all?
Thank you for the question. So I would be remiss to kind of speak to specific examples that are outside my area of expertise, but perhaps my colleagues within Shared Services Canada or Public Service Procurement Canada can speak to real examples in which they obtain value from some of their outsourcing engagements.
Yep, thank you. Maybe I can start. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. Actually, when it comes to IT, especially with the managed service, very often those services are more and more commoditized type services. It just does not make sense for the government to build its own, for example, cellular network or satellite type services. So this is where we go to private sector, and we typically purchase those services as fully managed service. In my opening remarks, I also mentioned our wide area network. So all of the fiber and the circuits, doesn't matter if it's fiber or copper, connecting our 4,000 locations we have across the country. Again, those is basically, we're taking advantage of commercial services. It just, from a business point of view, best practice, this is the right thing to do, and it always results in a lower IT costs to the government.
Sorry, thank you. I think I have 30 seconds. Is there a mechanism where you can quantify or qualify that service, the effectiveness of the outsourcing?
Thank you for the question. In terms of quantifying in dollars, I don't know. Typically, we go through a competitive process. There's a statement of work, and we establish service level agreements with those organizations, and then they're being measured based on the performance. They have to meet the service level for them so they can invoice to us as per the contract. If not, penalties will be applied. So difficult for me at this point to quantify in dollars the advantage of the outsourcing deals.
Thank you, Mr. Nadeau. We'll now go to Mr. Johns.
I was recently informed of a situation where lawn maintenance and groundskeeping work was contracted out by the Department of National Defence, and management proceeded with this decision despite the assertions accompanied by actually a business case of the Union of National Defence Employees and national offers that sending the work to the private sector would not save money. Personnel were assigned elsewhere and equipment was removed from the base inventory. And in the spring and summer of 2020, the private contractor failed to meet the requirements of the contract. So we know that scheduled military activities depend on grounds that are properly prepared. Public service workers were actually ordered to complete the work in the end without the necessary personnel and without the appropriate equipment, work that the contractor is being compensated for. Thus, the actual cost of completion is even greater than the cost of the contract. Now, governments always underwrite the risk when private contractors are involved. What risk mitigation strategies are in place to ensure that this sort of thing doesn't happen? And wouldn't it be easier to have the work done in-house?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. As I highlighted, from a Treasury Board policy perspective, there are requirements regarding the performance and management of performance of our contractors, particularly that there's monitoring and oversight in place to ensure that contractors are performing to the requirements of the contract, and that our contracting professionals are working closely with their clients, the individuals that may be receiving these services, to make sure that they're monitoring and documenting issues of poor performance. I cannot unfortunately speak to the specific contract or decision that you've highlighted, and that may be something that you wish to invite the department responsible to speak to.
Okay. I'm going to move a motion in the context of this study, and I've sent it for translation, but they can't get it back in time. I'm hoping that the committee will agree to it, and I'll read it into the record, that in the context of its study of outsourcing of contracts, the committee write to the Auditor General of Canada to recommend an audit of the implementation of the Treasury Board's Guide to Cost Estimating by departments in relation to make or buy decisions and oversight of the Treasury Board with respect to the same. So this is just, I think it's stronger coming from the committee versus coming from me as an individual MP, and I can't see why anyone would object to it. But can I, maybe Mr. Chair, if it's possible, to move this?
Thank you. And it's in order in the sense that it's considered part of the motion study. So, but it's a question of whether you want to debate that or have a question on it or wait.
I'd like to have it, at least so I can read it. I understand that you.
It's just not, just because we're in the middle of the study and right now translation's working on it. Maybe I think the clerk wants to speak to it.
The clerk will speak.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, for the benefit of the committee, Mr. Johns has sent the text of the motion to me. I've sent it for an emergency translation about a half an hour ago, but I have not yet received the translation. I cannot distribute anything on behalf of the committee that is unilingual. I cannot distribute the text. I can, if the committee wishes, reread the text into the record. The interpreters are following along, and they do have the text as well, but I cannot distribute the text at this time. However, there is no prohibition for Mr. Johns moving the motion or the committee entertaining debate on it, even though the French text is not currently available. Thank you.
Thank you. And before we continue, and because Ms. Vignola still has asked, so what I'm going to do is, and I see Mr. Housefather's hands up, so I will recognize that too. Before we do that, I'm going to, at this point in time, basically thank the witnesses for participating today and for all of you having a chance to say something to the committee. You were also, all three of you were basically asked to further some information. So if you collect that information, and once you've done that, if you would give that to the clerk, and the clerk would disperse that to the committee. And with that, I will dismiss the witnesses for today, and thank you for being here with us at this point in time. With that said, now, Mr. Johns, you have put forward a motion. Mr. Housefather.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was wondering if Mr. Johns and yourself would be amenable, given that we don't have a copy of the motion, to putting some time on Thursday's meeting to discuss this motion, and perhaps Ms. Vignola's as well, like to give maybe at the end of the meeting a proper amount of time for us to have a more fulsome debate of both. I'd like to have a chance to see this in writing and discuss it with my colleagues, and the same is actually true of Ms. Vignola's. I would like to, there certainly would have to be amendments to that one as well. And I'd prefer if we could have more time to actually discuss it than like 6 minutes at the end of a meeting. So I was just wondering, Mr. Chair, if that might be possible.
Mr. Housefather, are you moving a motion to adjourn the debate on this issue?
No, I was hoping there would be agreement from the mover that would be okay to do it on Thursday, and you yourself, Mr. Chair, to say it could be on the agenda.
Thank you. I will. Is the committee comfortable with having a discussion of this on Thursday after they've had a chance to see things in writing? And I'm seeing nods around the room to do that at this point in time, so we will add that to Thursday. Thank you, Mr. Hosman. Thank you, Mr. Johns. With that, we will now go to Ms. Vignola, and if she will read into the record her motion.
Alors, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. Last Friday, and you've all received a copy of a notice of motion from me, and I'll take the time now to read it out loud, as is our custom. And I'll proceed that pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee undertake a study of the expenses of the Office of the Governor-General's Secretary for its representation activities abroad and in Canada for the years 2015 to the present. That in light of the information disclosed during the meeting on Thursday, September 22, concerning the testimony of representatives of organisations related to the decision-making process and the use of budgets by and for the Office of the Governor-General's Secretary, the committee invite the following witnesses to testify. Ms. Christine McIntyre, Deputy Secretary, Policy, Program and Protocol Branch, Office of the Governor-General's Secretary. Stuart Wheeler, Chief of Protocol of Canada, Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development. Senior officials of the Department of Canadian Heritage, senior representatives of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and any other witness whom the committee deems appropriate to invite. The testimony take place over at least 3 meetings, and that the committee begin its study on Monday, October 24th, 2022, that the Department of National Defence, Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development, Department of Canadian Heritage and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police table the financial reports of the expenses incurred during the trips of the Governor-General from 2015 to present, as well as copies of invoices associated with the March 2022 trip to the Middle East of the Office of the Governor-General's Secretary, broken down by trip and by item of expenditure, including, in particular, accommodation costs, catering costs, caterer costs, travel costs, security costs, and the cost for alcohol and drinks, indicating the number of people included for each delegation. That the said documents be submitted in English and French and forwarded no later than Friday, October 21st, 2022 at noon to the clerk of the committee, and that the clerk forward them upon receipt to the members of the committee. That the committee report its observations and recommendations to the House. Now, I know that the motion is particularly long, and that's why we sent you a notice of motion. Now, why am I asking for all of this? After our committee meeting, we were made aware of details by way of a newspaper, and that is that members that they couldn't give us the information because they didn't have the information at their disposal, and yet a newspaper got their hands on the information in very quickly. So I'm not saying the wool was pulled over our eyes as a committee, but it does beg the question: how is it that prepared folks, competent folks, would appear before our committee without those figures at hand, and yet a newspaper got their hands on them? Now, moreover, their answers need to be gone over with a fine-tooth comb so that taxpayers can be fully abreast of what has occurred over the past 5 years. And this will give us the opportunity to engage in a comparative analysis. There's nothing warlike or bellicose in my request. I'm just asking for collaboration on their part and for us to put this matter to rest. Because honestly, I'm not going to go so far as to say that it's insulting. I won't venture there. But we are asking specific questions. We asked those folks to get prepared. The notice was moved in June 2022. So the onus was on them to be prepared, to get their hands on the information necessary. And yet, at the end of the day, in committee, we weren't informed of that information when a newspaper was. So I just want light to be cast on this matter, and I want us to be able to make recommendations as a consequence. And I'm being humble in my request. I just want to avoid this situation occurring again in the future. This is taxpayers' money, and our taxpayers have trouble making ends meet. And I imagine that some of us were on the list of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, and that I received about 500 emails from folks who are absolutely aghast at the expending. Now, these are francophones that wrote to me, and they're, of course, more likely to write to me, but there are 9 Anglophone provinces, and I imagine that you were completely overwhelmed by the influx of emails in English. So there you have it.
Nola, I have Mr. Hari and then Mr. McCauley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I had the opportunity to kind of read the motion. In my mind, I compartmentalize it in certain aspect. And I started with the value. And I agree that we need to really look and understand the money that the taxpayer entrusted us with us is spent in the right way, and then there's protocols in place, and gaps has been identified, and there is mitigation strategies. So from a value proposition of a study of this nature, I definitely support it. I looked at also the sense of urgency, and I looked at the sense of urgency versus other topics that it is on our plate. I had the opportunity to kind of do a little bit of a number crunching. By the end of this week, which we would have completed our first session on procurement diversity, we would be remain with 3 more sessions on outsourcing contract, 3 more sessions on procurement diversity, 1 session at least on shipbuilding. I believe the sub-Bs are going to come to our committee, so it's going to be at least 2 meetings on the sub-Bs. So there's a total of, based on my numbers, about 9 meetings that is in the front coming in. Now we have another motion which is relevant to the outsourcing, so that's now 10, and this will take us way beyond the 24. So from the start date being that prescribed as October 24th, I'm just looking at it from a pragmatic sequencing of events that we have and then comparing the urgency of that. I don't want to undermine or in any way say that this is not important. So I'm not talking about the importance, I'm talking about the urgency. Also, I wanted to be able to discuss why 3 meetings. Did you have in your mind that each one of the department will be discussed separately, or just trying to understand the 3 meetings is about 6 hours, and in this session we will have only remaining of anything else we want to do, probably another 6 or 7. So this would be like 50% of what's left. So I really like to get an understanding of that. Start time, I talked about it, around October 24th, and also the volume of the data. And you've gone back to 2015, and if you could, kind of expand why 2015. I would have understood if you said, hey, look, you know what? I would like to be able to get an understanding of the breakdown of 2022 and the specific trip that we had. And then if other information revealed yourself, you're in a position to be able to come back and say, hey, look, you know what? This thing popped up, so now I would like to get a better understanding. Going back to 2015, I felt, and I just talking about myself only, I felt that, okay, that was the time that I started, and that's the time. Why not 2010, or why not 2019? So again, given 2015, it's going to generate a lot of information. A lot of information of that coming to us on October 21st, and then being able to process that to get to in a meaningful contribution on October 24th is an area that it's amount of volume that I personally won't be able to process. So I would like, I would like to put on the table that the value I see, again, it has to be put into perspective, the urgency, the scope, the number of the meetings, start time, and the volume of the data that's being asked. So it would be good to get some feedback on that so we could put it into perspective. I'm sure we have an opportunity to work together, if you're amendable over the next while, to be able to kind of address the urgency, value, scope, number of meetings, start time, the volume of the data, and probably in a very kind of structured manner say, okay, 1 meeting or 2 meetings, or like 1 meeting, and get an understanding of what happened in 22, and then see whether we discover something else. Because this, to me, this is like, it's going to open up a floodgate. And it's a shotgun approach, and I understand. And if the objective of this, which I truly see the value, is coming up with recommendations, I'm not sure how that shotgun approach is going to give us that. But I thank you for listening.
I will now have Mr. Macaulay.
Thanks, Mr. Jouari, and thanks, Mrs. Vignola, for the motion. Generally, I'm in support of the motion for the big reason we were all here when they testified, and when you look at, we got a copy of all the receipts, and both parties from the Governor General's office and the RCAF very clearly either mistakenly misinformed or misled this committee or purposely misled this committee. There was very specific questions onto the costing, which we were misinformed of, and very specific questions on the menu, which we're very, very clearly misinformed of. So I think it is, as a committee, you know, I want to hear from them why this committee was mistakenly or purposely misled on two very simple, basic questions that all witnesses had all the information of. It wasn't like our previous witnesses earlier today where, you know, quite honestly, you know, some of the items, well, I don't know because it's pulled out from 5 years ago. All of our witnesses had the answer very clearly and yet gave the wrong information to the committee. So I'd just like to support this, to have them back and explain to Canadians. I got 1,300 emails in one day on the issue after the Taxpayers Federation sent it out. So I'd like to get to the bottom of the issue and get the straight facts. So I'm going to support it. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. McCauley. We have Mr. Housefather and then Mr. Johns. You're on mute, Mr. Housefather.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before I begin, may I just ask how long we have House resources for this meeting because we're past 1 o'clock?
So I'm watching the clock. We can go as long as we need to. However, the resources are saying 1:30. With that said, there is the option that as we get close to 1:30, we could extend this and move this as well as Mr. Johns to Thursday and continue the discussion at that point in time.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. My suggestion was indeed that we move this to Thursday. Et je vais juste m'expliquer.
And I'll just give my reasons why. I was also disappointed to see in the newspapers the day after our meeting a list of invoices that seemed different to the information that we were provided. Now, if it were a request to hold one meeting with the witnesses in attendance, with evidence of all the expenditures associated with that trip, perhaps that would be easy to move and pass. But here we have something much broader that will cut into our studies on procurement diversity, as well as the matter of outsourcing that are currently under study. And of course, there'll also be the study on defence and shipbuilding, and Mr. McCauley called for additional meetings. Therefore, it strikes me as a tad unfair that studies that are important to the Liberals and New Democrats, studies that we have been waiting for 7-8 months now, will be further delayed because of another study, and I just don't agree with that. I think that 3 unions, that's a lot. And going back to 2015 would imply that the Governor-General's spending was associated with the Government of Canada, because that was the year in which the Liberals were elected, and we all know full well that there is no link here in terms of how the Office of the Governor-General operates and between the governments. So I'd like to move amendments or see amendments, think about those amendments, and have all parties have an opportunity to move amendments and to reach with a view of reaching a consensus on Thursday. So I suggest that we take a fresh look at this on Thursday with sufficient time at our disposal, having previously looked at the amendments. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Housefather. I now have Mr. Johns and then Mr. Paul Hoos, and then I'll end with Ms. Vignola. So Mr. Johns first.
Okay. First, really appreciate the motion, and I support most of it. The only thing is around dates, and I agree that we should be going back to 2010 to the present, so we get a full, wholesome look at the expenses over the last 12 years, and also the start date. And that said, like if we go back to 2010, we should probably give them a little bit longer to get the documents to us. So it says October 21st. Maybe we extend that to October 31st. And maybe we can find a compromise, like that we start this study no later than November 15th. You know what I mean? Like, so that we get it done before Christmas and the holiday season, right? But I agree, we've got a lot of studies on the go right now, so it's kind of hard to shelve 3 studies and add another one, and now we're working on 4 studies. So I'm hoping Ms. Vignola would be, open to those kind of changes. But I do think we should look at also the previous government. What is the difference? There a significant increase in expenses, and also this study. I want to make sure we get all the accurate information. So giving the government a little bit longer than a few weeks, I think, make sure we get the right information, because clearly, when we're reading the paper the next day after they testify here, that the information's changed. That's not okay, right? So want to make sure we get the accurate information. So those are my thoughts and feedback.
Thank you. And I have Mr. Paul Hoos and Mr. Hari. However, I'm going to let Ms. Vignola maybe answer some of the questions that were put out there earlier.
Mine is a clarification.
Pardon?
Sorry, mine was just...
Okay, just to maybe, if she can answer a couple, perhaps that might solve. So I'll let Ms. Vignola maybe, I know she was taking down some notes in particular to some of the questions, Mr. Johari, so that we don't forget those and we get that in. So Ms. Vignola.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. The main reason I'm asking for 3 meetings is that I don't want everyone to appear at the same time if there were to be more people than the 3 people that we invited in the first place. So by having 3 meetings, they could be 1-hour meetings, for example, we wouldn't have a crowd of witnesses and we'd be able to focus on those in attendance. It's just a question of logistics and time management. And because it can be quite unpleasant when there are 3, 4, 5 witnesses all appearing at the same time and we don't have enough time to question them. So, and that would give me a little bit of a nudge if we were to approach it in this manner. Now, as far as the calendar is concerned, why 2015? You were the one that pointed out that that's the year in which the Liberal government was elected. But I'm asking for 2015 to provide a comparative analysis. 2015 through to today. Well, there's been a pandemic. We have a new Governor-General who's quite recent and hasn't travelled much. So by having it from 2015 to the present day, well, we also address the 2 years where there's been no travel, and that will enable us to make an analysis. We can go back to 2010 if you wish. I take no issue with that. We can go back to 1867 and do a comparative analysis. But that's not my goal here. And my goal isn't to put the government in hot water. I think you're starting to get to know me here. My objective here is to be effective and efficient and ensure that the taxpayers' money is well spent and that we have a true handle on that spending. The date of 2015, I just didn't pull it out of a hat, and it has nothing to do with the Liberal government being elected or anything to do with Mr. Harper. It's because of the pandemic. Had there not been a pandemic, I would have gone back 5 years instead of 7 in my motion. Next matter. Yes, we're talking about a lot of information here, but that information should have already been collected. And apparently it already has been, because the journalists got their hands on it before we did, didn't they? So we're just asking for the same information that the journalists were able to obtain at the end of the day, right? And I'm aware we're talking about a lot of information. Now, as far as invoices are concerning, I'm just talking about the invoices from March 2022, not invoices from the past 7 years, because I like to eat, to sleep, have a family life in addition to my parliamentary duties, just like each and every one of you around the table. Now, As far as the dates are concerned for documentation and for the meetings themselves, obviously the sooner the better would be my preference. I don't want us to be vague in our scheduling here, but that said, Mr. Gord's suggestion of the 31st of October for submission of documents would be fine, and then the 15th of November for the first meeting. I'm happy with that. I'd be comfortable with that. But I just don't want to be left in the dark, just like on the highway. No one likes to drive in a foggy conditions or in the dark, so I want to clarify things. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Vignola. Where are we here? Sorry. Mr. Paul Hoos and then Mr. Johari, or Ms. Johari, you're comfortable with your answer? We'll go to Ms. Paul Hoos anyway.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Well, we are in favour of the block's motion. That said, it needs to be tweaked, in our opinion, and I think that we should resume the debate at the next meeting, but I'd call for adjournment given the hour.
Okay, so the...
Oh, now I understand. Yes, I do support that, yes.
So we're adjourning debate till a later date, till
Yeah, the
Thursday.
same thing we used to do. Okay, got it.
Thank you.
Okay.
I declare the meeting adjourned.